A quiet neighborhood, an imposing mansion, and a family that seemed to be the perfect reflection of the American dream. But how far can appearance be from reality? And what happens when internal tensions fracture even the most impeccable image? David Crespi, a man respected by his community and admired in professional circles, seemed to have it all. A brilliant career, a loving family, and a life built on pillars of success. But could the constant pressure of expectations and internal ghosts that are never faced become the trigger for an unimaginable event? The answers to these questions would change the perception of everyone who knew him. If you're fascinated by unraveling the darkest mysteries and exploring gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and become part of our investigative community. Let's get to the case. In Sacramento, David was born into a family that prioritized education and professional prestige. After graduating with honors in 1983, his future in the financial world seemed assured. A meteoric career took him to top positions, while he devotedly raised his two children, Jessica and Josh, after the tragic loss of his first wife. It was then that Kimberly, an old acquaintance from his college days, entered his life, completely transforming it. Their love blossomed, and together they built a family that soon expanded with the birth of 3 more children, including twins Tessara and Samantha. In 2001, an opportunity for a prestigious position moved him and his family to Matthews, North Carolina. There, life seemed perfect. The 3-story house stood as a symbol of his success, and the neighborhood streets radiated serenity. David, in addition to his role as vice president of a major bank, was a pillar in his local church. But behind that idyllic facade, the shadows of a persistent internal struggle were quietly growing. David had dealt with emotional problems since his youth, a battle that seemed to have been brought under control but, in reality, had never gone away. By 2006, that struggle was about to come to a head. His life, so meticulously structured, was beginning to falter. What no one in Matthews expected was that the nearby forest, a place that symbolized peace and disconnection, would become the scene of a discovery that would shake the entire community. What did investigators find in those trees? The answer, as chilling as it was unexpected, would leave an indelible mark on those who knew it. Hearing the wheels screech as they came to a stop was something Kimberly would never forget. As David spoke coldly about crashing his car into a crowd, a shadow of unease crossed her face. The words, though spoken in an almost casual tone, left an icy void in the air of the car. Kimberly attributed it to fatigue or his trademark dark mood, but inside David, that line between rational and frighteningly impulsive was beginning to blur. In the days that followed, David spent more time locked in his office. Closed doors and drawn curtains became his shield against a world he felt increasingly hostile. Kimberly, who had always been his rock, began to notice a deeper change. Although she tried to minimize the signs, her husband was clearly losing control. That night, as they ate dinner as a family, David abruptly got up, leaving his plate untouched. He said he needed some fresh air, but instead of walking through the garden, he drove for hours to a nearby forest. There, in the dark, he let his darkest thoughts manifest themselves without restraint. The forest soon became a recurring place in his nocturnal escapades. David described it as a peaceful space, but in reality, it was a refuge for his tormented mind. It was there that he began to fantasize about acts of violence. The images that flashed through his mind were not just fleeting. They were vivid, detailed, and left him exhausted when he returned home. Kimberly tried to ignore the dirt marks on his shoes or the smell of the woods that permeated his clothes, but something inside her told her that she shouldn't leave him alone for too long. One afternoon, while organizing papers on her husband's desk, she found a notebook with pages filled with disturbing scribbles. Human figures scratched out violently, descriptions of scenarios that seemed drawn from a deeply disturbed mind. The confrontation that followed was explosive. David denied everything, saying it was a cathartic exercise recommended by his therapist. Kimberly wanted to believe him, but doubt began to take root in her mind. Shortly thereafter, an incident further shook her fragile reality. At a family gathering, while the children were playing in the yard, David stood motionless, staring at them from a window. Kimberly called out to him, but he did not respond. When he finally turned to her, his eyes showed a mixture of sadness and something much more disturbing, a complete disconnect with the moment. That would be one of the last days of apparent normalcy in the Crespi house. Normally filled with childish laughter and quiet conversation, the Crespi house was plunged into an eerie silence. That January noon, the sun illuminated the kitchen windows as David carefully placed a knife on the counter, his heavy breathing echoing the dark thoughts that consumed him. Samantha, still smiling from the excitement of the game, didn't notice the change in her father's expression. In an instant, the line between reality and the abyss in David's mind crumbled. Stifled screams echoed briefly before all was quiet again. David, staring blankly, remained motionless, holding the gun as if time had been suspended. It was then that a faint sound brought him back to the present, small footsteps approaching cautiously. Tessara, emerging from his hiding place, stopped as he saw his father standing in front of his sister's body. It took her childish mind a few seconds to process what was in front of her, but when she did, a piercing shriek rent the air. David slowly looked up at his youngest daughter. His eyes reflected a mixture of confusion and despair, as if searching for an answer in the child's horrified face. Tessara, paralyzed with fear, began to back away slowly, but her small body could not hold her for long. She tripped over a chair and fell, which woke David from his trance. "Come here, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper as he slowly approached. The high-pitched screams of Tessara could be heard through the walls, but no one was there to hear her. The house, once a haven of love and joy, became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. When Kimberly returned at 12:50, she found the front door locked. Upon entering, a heavy silence greeted her, something that didn't fit with the usual bustle of her daughter's playing. Calling out to the girls and getting no response, she headed for the kitchen. There, the floor was stained with something she first thought was spilled liquid, until her gaze settled on David's blood-stained hands as he held Tessara in his arms. "I couldn't leave her alone," he said, his voice empty of emotion. Kimberly, paralyzed with terror, couldn't look away from her daughters as reality began to sink in. The scene she witnessed would forever change her life, and the lives of everyone who knew the Crespi family. The interrogation room was cold and silent, an absolute contrast to the storm David Crespi claimed to carry in his mind. Sitting across from the detective, his posture was relaxed, but his empty eyes told a different story. The first few minutes passed in tense silence until the man began to speak. "The voices, I couldn't silence them," he murmured as he described in chilling detail the moments leading up to the act that would forever mark the Crespi family. David recounted how the supposed voices had assured him that he was saving his twin girls from a future filled with pain, ruin, and heartbreak. "They knew," he stated in an almost monotone voice, justifying his act. According to his confused logic, Samantha and Tessara could feel their suffering, and by sparing them from that fate, he was protecting them. To the officers present, the coldness with which he spoke was as disturbing as the details of the crime. Meanwhile, outside the police station, the media did not rest. Cameras surrounded the entrance, and each new headline was more sensational than the last. "Successful banker or monster in hiding," read a banner in front of the family home now cordoned off. Neighbors who had previously praised David's kindness and devotion to his family were in shock. One neighbor recalled seeing David playing in the yard with the twins weeks earlier. "He looked so happy," she said, with tears in her eyes. Kimberly, meanwhile, was in a state of disbelief and devastation. In later interviews, she confessed that she could not reconcile the image of the man she loved with the perpetrator of such a brutal act. "How did I not see it coming?" she kept repeating. But the signs had been there, the periods of isolation, the strange comments, the invisible weight that seemed to crush him in recent months. The trial, which was scheduled for mid-year, promised to be one of the most contentious cases in recent North Carolina history. The courtroom was crowded with expectant faces, each searching for answers that would never quite come. Kimberly, her face pale but firm, took a seat in the front row, determined to defend her husband's complex humanity to the jury. Meanwhile, David remained unmoved in his seat, his eyes fixed on an undefined point, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Testimony began with psychiatrists who had treated David for years. They described how his mind had constantly oscillated between moments of lucidity and dark episodes, marked by deep despair. One of the specialists explained that the abrupt discontinuation of medication might have exacerbated his already precarious mental equilibrium. The combination of psychotic depression and an inadequately treated bipolar disorder is a ticking time bomb, he stated in a gravelly voice. Kimberly, when she took the stand, spoke of the tireless struggle they had both waged against her husband's illness. She recounted how David had sought help again and again, trying to preserve normalcy for his family. However, she also described nights when she would find him sitting in the dark, muttering about voices that haunted him and led him to question his own sanity. He was a man torn between reality and an abyss he could not control, he said, as his voice trembled. While the defense insisted on David's inability to discern between reality and fantasies driven by his disorder, the prosecution argued that the Jonda 20 acts showed troubling premeditation. The 911 operator testified that David's call had been clear and methodical, detailing the events precisely. He didn't sound like someone out of control, he noted. In an unexpected twist, an email was presented that David had sent to his physician days before the incident, describing his fears about the effects of the new medication. In the message, he had mentioned feeling strangely distant and having thoughts he could not understand. The prosecution used this evidence to question why she had not sought immediate help. The defense, however, argued that the mail showed that David was fully aware that something was wrong, but was caught in a spiral of despair. The trial progressed slowly, as tension inside and outside the courtroom grew. The media was filled with headlines about the case, debating the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry, the mental health system, and most of all, David himself. Kimberly stood her ground, repeating to those who would listen that David was not a monster, but a man broken by an illness that had spiraled out of control. Among the most disturbing evidence presented, however, was the testimony of a neighbor who recalled seeing David standing in front of his house the night before the incident, motionless in the rain, mumbling something unintelligible. When asked by the neighbor if he was okay, David simply replied, "Sometimes the storm inside us is stronger than the one outside." The echoing footsteps of the guards echoed down the hallway as David, handcuffed, was led into the visiting room. Kimberly was waiting for him on the other side of the glass, her eyes swollen from crying, but with an expression of determination. The children were absent this time. She decided it was best not to expose them to another emotionally draining day. When David sat down across from her, the initial seconds passed in silence. Kimberly, taking a deep breath, finally took the floor. "Why didn't you tell me everything from the beginning?" she asked, her voice cracking but firm. David, avoiding her gaze, replied, "I thought I could handle it. I didn't want you to know how broken I was." As they talked, the details of that January 20th morning began to emerge more clearly. David described how, sitting at the computer, he had felt an unusual pressure in his chest. The irrational thought that something terrible would happen to his daughters if he didn't act suddenly came over him. He tried to distract himself, reading emails and checking bank numbers, but the internal voices whispered louder and louder. Kimberly listened intently, trying to understand how her husband's mind had driven him into the abyss. David confessed that he had tried to resist, that he had even had a glass of water and taken a deep breath in the backyard before returning to the house. "But it was as if my own shadow was dragging me," he said, staring blankly. "I couldn't escape what was inside me." Meanwhile, defense attorneys continued to work on a strategy that combined medical evidence with testimony from family members and acquaintances. During the court sessions, a disturbing pattern was revealed in David's medical history. Conflicting interactions of his medications had led to episodes of extreme paranoia in the past, something he had downplayed or not fully shared with his doctors. One of the most shocking moments of the trial came when the prosecutor presented security camera footage from a nearby store. In the video, taken days before the incident, David was seen buying new knives, something the prosecution took as a sign of premeditation. The defense, however, argued that the purchase was to replace old kitchen utensils and that there was no evidence of criminal intent. As the trial progressed, the tension inside the courtroom was palpable. Each testimony seemed to add a new layer of complexity to the case. Kimberly, who continued to publicly support her husband, faced fierce criticism from the community. Many accused her of complicity for failing to act on earlier warning signs, while others praised her for her unwavering fortitude. In one of the most emotional hearings, a former colleague of David's testified about the visible deterioration of his behavior in the previous months. He seemed trapped in his own mind, as if he was fighting something he couldn't control, the man said, as jurors took careful notes. The halls of the courtroom were filled with David's sorry words, but for many, they weren't enough to ease the weight of what had happened. Even though the 2 life sentences could not be changed, they left a hole in the family and in the community that closely watched the case. However, the final chapter of the trial did not mark the closure of this tragedy. Kimberly, with a resolution that many did not understand, decided to face the shadows that had ravaged her life. Weeks after sentencing, she began organizing lectures at local universities, detailing the dangers of underdiagnosis of mental disorders and the unpredictable impact of certain medications. Her talks were both poignant and heartbreaking. "I'm not here to justify what my husband did," she once said. "I'm here to make sure other families don't suffer what mine has suffered." Meanwhile, inside the prison, David immersed himself in an intensive therapy program, supervised by psychiatrists specializing in forensic mental health. The records of his sessions revealed a disturbing pattern. Although he was aware of his actions and expressed deep remorse, he still struggled with intrusive thoughts that disconnected him from reality. In one of his writings, found by therapists, he mentioned, "Voices don't disappear, they just learn to hide." The days in prison passed slowly. David participated in manual labor and mandatory group sessions, although he maintained an emotional distance from the other inmates. According to a psychological report, he continued to repress key details of his mental state in an effort not to appear more vulnerable than he already was. However, one of the therapists, after months of sessions, concluded that David was not an evil man, but someone completely dominated by his illness. Kimberly, for her part, began to receive threats from people who could not accept her decision to support her husband. Despite this, she continued to visit him weekly, bringing with her drawings of her older children, who were struggling to rebuild their lives away from the media impact of the case. During one such visit, she handed him an album of family photos. "I want you to remember who you were before everything fell apart," she told him, hinting at the hope she still held in her heart. David Crespi's case not only shook a community, but left a legacy of questions that still haunt society. How far does the responsibility of a person under the effects of a poorly treated mental illness go? And how can the system ensure that tragedies like this do not happen again?